friends. Welcome back to the next session on operations, planning, scheduling, and control. Now let's begin with our learning. In this particular schedule, we'll understand with the concepts of ascertaining the gaps, the learning objectives. At the end of this particular session, the learners will be able to understand what do we mean by ascertaining the gaps, what are the various gaps in the operational activities, and what are the various control and the measures that have been undertaken to overcome those gaps. Now let us understand what do we mean by ascertaining the gaps. In a particular organization, every activity that is being undertaken is on a frequent or is always on a regular basis. Now when an operational or manufacturing activity is being undertaken, one product is always moving through the another product. That is a sequence or a series of activities has been undertaken in terms of an operational cycle or an assembly line which is into existence. So a rapid increase or decrease in a certain activity with respect to the price, with respect to the cost and the activity that is being undertaken, there are various challenges which may occur to arise or to see that a particular activity may be performed or a particular activity may not be performed. The various concepts as to the challenges, the shortages, the natural disaster, the political instability, and so on can potentially result to a certain jeopardy situation in a particular concern or an organization. And hence, when these particular types of situations or concerns arises, it finds out or it leads with how do we find a certain activity, whether it is completed or whether it is not completed. When a particular activity is been completed within the specific time period, then such type of activity is called as a part of a scheduled performance, wherein there is no deviation between the actuals and the standards. But in case of a certain organization or a certain activity, when the activities are not being performed according to the plan and according to these schedules that was been maintained, then we do observe that there are certain gaps that have been identified. That is a particular activity which is not been completed within the specific time period. So identifying the various reasons and causes of those consideration in which a certain gap or a certain situation or has been arised, the activity or a series of activity is not been completed, then such consideration is called as ascertaining the gaps. Now, these particular type of gaps may be identified in terms of processing, in terms of manufacturing, in terms of goods, in terms of services, and so on. Let's say now in this particular diagram or picture, you can see a certain example with respect to the certain goods, services, or commodities are available at certain location, but they are not available at certain locations. And here, where the goods and services have been available, that particular place is called as an occupied place. And whereas the place where the goods and services are not been available, that particular place is called as a gap, wherein the product or commodity is not been fulfilled in that particular rack or certain position or in the assembly line. Now let us understand what are the various procedures or activities that have been undertaken to identify the gaps. Number one is product gap analysis. And so the various steps or the measures that can be undertaken to identify the gap are the processes of gap analysis that can be undertaken. Number one is the current state. So in case of the current state, one needs to clearly identify as to what is the current situation or scenario of a certain organization. Based on those considerations, one needs to clearly understand as to what is the current scenario, what are the various products that have been manufactured, how they have been delivered, and in what way the product or series of activities can be undertaken. And hence, understanding the mobile shopping apps that displays the comparison of customer reviews. So that's an example of understanding the current state, wherein you have to understand that what product is available, what is the demand for that certain product, and how the product can be fulfilled as a part of a consideration. The next consideration is the desired state. So mobile shopping apps that have been displayed side by side and a product comparison is being shown, then such type of analysis is called the product gap analysis, wherein the analysis as to the current state and the desired state is being undertaken. The next step is identifying the actual gap which is into existence. The consideration of actual gap focuses on what has been activity that has been conducted, whether it is a misguided activity or whether it is a flagship feature. So based on those considerations, whether it is a primary or whether it is secondary, and on those particular basis, the gaps can be identified. And lastly, the fourth step that needs to be undertaken is the concept of remedies. So shifting in the budget, time, resources, and developing the future activities or the features activities is essentially important required in terms of the activities that are being performed. So the activities that has been undertaken in order to identify the product gap analysis deals with the consideration of the current state, the desired state, the gap analysis, and the remedies. And hence, in these particular ways, the gap analysis in a certain organization can be undertaken. Now let us understand what are the various elements or practices of identifying the gap analysis. Number one, the first element or practice is continuous improvement. In an organization, in order to see that all those activities have been performed in a very effective way, we need to identify what activities can be conducted, in what way it can be fulfilled. So the continuous improvement activity as to an assessment of activity, how it is being undertaken, and whether there are certain improvements in those activities needs to be assessed and identified. And hence, that's a concept of continuous improvement. The another terminology for continuous improvement which is commonly used is called as an Kaizen. The second step or activity or the elements that can be undertaken is eliminating the waste. So elimination of waste is essentially important in a certain organization wherein we try to identify and see that how the number of waste that is being created is being reduced, and we consider the scenario of optimum utilization of the scarce resources. And hence elimination of waste is essentially important, based on which one can come to a conclusion as to what are the various resources that have been used or employed or deployed, and how those particular resources or waste can be conducted in a better, effective, and efficient way. The third step that can be undertaken here in this particular case is the good housekeeping. So in case of an housekeeping or the stores department, all the activities or all the goods, services, and commodities needs to be arranged in a very equal way, in a proper sequential manner, in which there is no any wastage or salvage that has been created. All the activities have been conducted in a very sequential order, in a particular fashion and manner, and hence elements or practices as to good housekeeping plays a very important role. It also considers the scenario of how do we display the products, what is the scenario as to the availability of in raw material, in the goods, services, process delivery, and so on. And hence, good housekeeping is also essentially important. The next perspective or the concern that one needs to understand is setting up time reduction. So in case of setting up the time reduction, it is very necessary and essential to see that how do we conduct those particular activities, and the time that has been conducted for each and every activity is been reduced. And hence, for those particular consideration, it is necessary to identify and see that what is the schedule performance indicators, what time is conduced or it is being used by the different activities and processes, and how are we saving each and every single point of time that has been conducted or that has been utilized. So setting up the time reduction is essentially important to see that all the activities have been completed within the specific time period and they achieve the target as to the completion of a certain time. The next element or practice that can be implemented is leveled or mixed production. So there should be a feature of the leveled or mixed production which focuses on a certain activity as a part of a consideration as to how do we conduct a common mixture or a proportion of the conduction of the activities. And hence leveling or mixing the production activities in case of a certain organization where several number of activities needs to be completed are called the good practices of gap identification and gap fulfillment. Now let us understand what are the 8 problems that have been associated with respect to gaps and how it has been correlated with the packaging supply. Number one, there are issues with the predicting. So when we organize a particular activity or whenever a particular plan or activity is being scheduled in a manufacturing organization, we always try to prepare the actual activity and we try to budget the projected activity. So on the basis of budgeted activity and the projected activity, there is always identified a gap as to the prediction. The prediction is always either greater or the prediction is always lower. Where in case if the prediction is more higher or it is greater, then accordingly the achieved perceived value is always less. And where the prediction is lower, the actual activity that has been produced or the material that has been required is much higher. So in this case, there are always issues with the prediction, and hence there is a mismatch between the activities that can be conducted in a business organization. The second perspective here, that the problem that can be identified is dealing with the surge demand. Always, as we have seen the concept of law of demand, always the demand for a certain product either increases or the demand for a certain product decreases. In case of a certain activity where the demand is much higher, then accordingly the price of that particular value is also increasing. And in case the price of the certain products is been decreasing, the demand for the particular product increases. And here in this case, what happened? There is an inverse relationship between the quantity demanded and the price for a certain product. And hence, this also comes into picture as to the problem that can be associated with the respect of gap identification. And hence, the supply activities cannot be conducted in a very effective and efficient way. The next perspective or the problem that has been associated is additional planning and trainings have been required. Any activity that has been conducted in a certain organization, always there is a certain drawback or a limitation as to the completion of those particular activity. And always we cannot be identified and sure as to whether the activity will be completed within the specific time period or not. And hence, always an additional plan that is been required. So, wherein in usually terms we call it as a plan B. So, everywhere wherever the plan B is needed to be required and implemented, then in these particular cases, the cost also increases, and accordingly, there is an additional training that is been required to be given to the people and the participants. And hence, additional planning is essentially required. There is a less control over the supply chain. So, being the supply chain most of the crucial consideration of the particular organization of a manufacturing unit, there is always, at many a times, it has been observed that there is a less control on the supply chain activity. And hence, when the supply chain activity is of a not greater importance, then on those particular basis, the control being the less of a certain consideration, it identifies as a certain gap, and hence the activity is not being conducted in a very effective way. Unusual occurrences or the calamities. So there are various unforeseen circumstances due to which a supply chain or a manufacturing activity or an operational activity may get impacted, and hence it ultimately differs or it also impacts the supply activity. So for those particular consideration, wherever there are unusual occurrences of certain events, it creates a gap in the organization, and accordingly there is a mismatch between the production and operations and supply chain activity that can be undertaken. The next problem that can be identified or usually occur is an increase in the IT infrastructure spending. So with respect to the changes in the tools, technologies and manufacturing processes, the various robotics and tools and techniques are being applied, and hence it increases the cost to the organization. So with increase in the IT expenditure, with increase to the cost in the organization, the implementation cost also increases and the operational cost also increases for those particular consideration. And hence, with the increase in the IT infrastructure spending, an additional training is being required, additional time needs to be associated, and the system to become its familiar consumes a certain amount of time, and hence the spending on those particular infrastructure also increases, which increases the total cost of a certain product, and hence there the gaps can be identified in a very easily concern. Having to rely on a single provider. So being a certain provider of a certain limited extent, certain providers of certain goods and services are of a limited nature, and hence from those particular perspectives, the gaps can be identified at an easy level, and the problem in the business organization may occur at the gradual stage. The customer contentment. In case of the customer contentment, always the customer is looking at the better qualitative product and a feasible or a stable rate pricing policy which is prevailing into the market. So always it is challenge to the organization as to see that how we can provide the maximum amount of quality in the controlled price scenario. And hence the customer contentment as to the quality, time, delivery of product, quantity concerns, all those things needs to be considered on a simultaneous basis, and it creates a problem in gap identification and fulfillment of those particular gaps and supplying the goods and services to the ultimate consumer. Now let us understand what is the application of strategy that can be used in ascertaining the gaps. Number one, creating the optimum plan that balances the production efficiency and deliver the performance. So we need to create a certain plan which is always used or which can be implemented at the optimum level and which will create a balance between the production activity and the delivery performance. So a certain plan needs to be implemented and initiated which creates a certain balance as to how the activity between the production line and the completion, that is the delivery time, can be matched, and all the gaps that can be identified can be reduced at the greater level. The next perspective or the application strategy that can be used is increasing the income by increasing the throughput on the bottleneck resources. So there are various bottleneck resources that have been identified in a business organization, and we need to increase the income of a particular individual or a particular machine or a particular component. So by increasing the income level, we can increase the throughput, the process activities can be streamlined in a better way, and accordingly the bottleneck resources can be reduced. So if a bottleneck is supposed to be arising in a business organization, one should try to invest or surge in more amount of money or amount of income, which will increase the productivity, which will increase the output ratio, and accordingly the bottlenecks will automatically be resolved or it will be elapsed. Reducing the stocks by synchronizing the supply and demand. Always, it is usually considered that in order to achieve the BEP, that is break-even point, there should be an equal proportion between demand and between the supply that is being achieved in a business organization. And hence, for reducing the stocks in a business organization, it is necessary to see that how do we maintain the balance and stability between the demand and supply factors. So, for balance between a demand and supply, it is essentially required and needed to see that how do we create the balance in those particular perspectives, and the quantity demanded is being supplied within the specific time period, and accordingly we achieve the break-even point with respect to the profit and loss that we are earning. Ensuring resources capability is visible throughout the organization. So visibility of product, that is in case of a certain raw materials, in case of stores, or in case of inventory, it should be always visible to all the organizational departments, wherein any organization or any department, if they want to feel and they want to assess the availability of resources, it should be always very easy and convenient to them, based on which the production activity, the operational activity, the supply chain activity, the strategic planning, the financial planning, the human resource policy can be undertaken in a better way, and accordingly those particular plans and policies as per the modifications can be implemented in the business organization. Making scenario based decision making possible. So as per the scenario changes in the short term or in the long term, the scenario should be acceptable and be flexible, in which the decision making authority or the taking of various severe decisions is effectively and possibly undertaken in any of the business concerns. So the scenario based decision making should be undertaken in which either there is an increase or either a recession period or a boom period. All the applications can be of a strategy can be undertaken in a very effective way, and which will generate the fruits or benefits to the organization. Now let us understand what are the various advantages and disadvantages of ascertaining the gaps. The major advantage of ascertaining the gaps are it reduces the space that has been needed. So if the gaps in the organization are been identified in effective consideration or at a earlier level, it helps to reduce the space that is been required for conduction of business activities. The smaller investment. So the investment that has been required for ascertaining the gaps and the resultant output is also very smaller investment perspective. So we need not to incur the more amount of money for the ascertaining the gaps and the measures that needs to be undertaken for ascertaining and fulfilling those particular gaps. Waste elimination or reduction. So accordingly, the waste or the resources that may occur at a certain point of time get reduces over a period of time, and accordingly we can reduce or eliminate the waste that is being conducted in a business organization. Now let us understand what are the various disadvantages or limitations for ascertaining the gaps. Number one, risk of running out of the stock. So on the basis of ascertaining the gaps, the amount of money, goods, services, commodity and articles in the organization are required. It is always visible. So when the particular product or commodity is always visible, there can be an excessive purchase or there can be an shortage of purchase between the business organization, and hence the company or a business organization or a manufacturing unit at times may run out of stock in order to achieve a certain amount of target. So when certain targets have been set, then accordingly on those particular basis, the organization can run out of the stock, and accordingly the business activities can be conducted in not an effective way. Dependency on the suppliers. So while ascertaining the gaps, certain activities are being targeted at a certain level, and with those particular consideration, the dependency on the various participants or in the various suppliers increases simultaneously. So with those particular consideration, when the supplier dependency increases, it always leads to a certain lead time or the lag time, and accordingly the activity is not being completed within the specific time period. And lastly, more planning is been required. So essentially, additional planning is been required when we need to implement or when we need to adopt the policy of ascertaining the gaps, which needs to be of an costly affair or a investment perspectives for a part of a business organization. Now let us understand what is the emphasis of plan for a certain consideration. Where do we need to identify a certain gap? So in order to identify the gap in an operational activity or a particular manufacturing activity in the business concern, the various deployments of advanced planning and software or scheduling activities can be undertaken. So on the basis of APS, that is advanced planning and scheduling software, the various activities can be streamlined in an effective way, and the manufacturing or the operations level activities can be taken to the next level, which ultimately tries to increase the production level or the efficiency of the business organization. And hence, the plan that needs to be implemented as to the ascertaining of the gaps should be very effective, should be feasible and acceptable in all the changing terms and conditions. The advanced planning and scheduling software is a positive step which increases the efficiency and lean industrial operations, that is the usage of advanced planning and scheduling software. So it is always a positive approach towards the creation of business organization and how we can streamline all the manufacturing and supply chain activities in the business consideration. So the organizational gap analysis is essentially important to enhance and to see that how companies' organizational performance can be increased within the specific time period. Arrangement and sequencing of all those activities right from the raw material to the completion of finished goods is essentially needs to be identified, on which basis the difference between the current results and the standard model can be established, and we can make a proper comparison as to how the business organization can fulfill in a better and effective way. So, to create a comparison, each organization employs a range of instruments, and various range of instruments that can be employed is with respect to the usage of software, with respect to the gap analysis, with respect to the calculation techniques, and so on. And from those particular perspectives, the gap analysis can be undertaken in a very effective way. Now let's summarize what we have learned in this particular session. In this particular session, we have understood what do we mean by assessment of ascertaining the gaps, what are the various activities and plannings that is been required while ascertaining the certain gaps, and how do we implement the policy or the scenario of ascertaining the gaps in the business organization. I hope you must have enjoyed the learning in this particular session. We'll stay connected and we'll continue with our learning. Thank you for your patience listening. Thank you.